Welcome to the final episode of season 1.5 of Read by the Author. Let's get right to the show and hear the conclusion of Blood Ties by Tarah Benner.
Chapter 9. Gabriel. The sushi bar was crowded when I pulled up in the parking lot. It was a sleek, modern restaurant with ceiling-to-floor windows that ran the entire length of the building. The name of the restaurant was burned into the hanging wooden sign over the door, with Japanese characters underneath. Parking my car, I got out and pushed my way through the clump of people congregating inside the door. Wesley's truck was already there, so I assumed he'd gotten a table. The strong aroma of fish assailed me as I walked through the door, and I wrinkled my nose as I cast around. Gabe. I looked over and saw Wesley sitting at a low bamboo table in the far back corner. He looked extremely out of place, propped up on a silk pillow at a knee-high table. A pale-haired woman was seated beside him, and I felt a slight tingle along the back of my neck. I held back a groan. So that was why he'd wanted to meet here. Wesley wasn't a sushi kind of guy, but he was accommodating to a fault. Whenever he was dating someone new, he went along with whatever she liked. I'd seen him do yoga and transcendental meditation. He'd even gone vegan for a week. This woman was pale, very thin, and fine-boned. She had long golden hair that glowed slightly red in the dim light that hung over the table. She wore bright scarlet lipstick and a plum velvet jacket with little wingtips that jutted out at the shoulders. She looked to be in her early 40s, but she was probably at least 200. The stink of vampire was so strong as I approached that I would have smelled it in the parking lot had it not been for the fish. A low growl rumbled in my throat, too soft to be audible to Wesley. "Gabe, I'd like for you to meet Letitia." The vampire held out her hand, presumably so that I would sit. "How do you do?" I hesitated. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to leap across the table and stake her with a chopstick, but the restaurant was full of people. "Sit down, Gabriel," the vampire ordered. I shot Wesley a glance, but he looked at me glassy-eyed, so the vampire was controlling him. She reached across the table for the squatty black teapot and poured with a graceful white hand. "Sit down," she repeated, not looking up, "or I'll break your brother's neck." Moving slowly with the effort of maintaining my self-control, I sank down onto a red silk cushion. Every muscle in my body was clenched, straining against my effort not to rip into the vampire. "I hear you're the one who murdered my protégés," said Letitia coolly. "So they were yours," I said, not mentioning that it had been a group effort. Her hand was steady on the handle of the teapot, but I could see the fury dancing behind her cold black eyes. I'd felt pretty confident that killing the new clan would bring their sire out into the open, and it turned out I'd been right. To be fair, they did try to murder me first. "Let's skip the games," said Letitia curtly. "Fine. How about you let my brother go, and I won't go back to Hilltop to finish off the rest of your clan?" "That doesn't work for me. You killed 6 healthy young vampires who were like family to me. It only seems appropriate that I take something from you." I glanced at Wesley. He hadn't batted an eye at the talk of murder, which told me he was deeply brainwashed. "If you hurt my brother," I rumbled, swiveling my gaze back to her, "I won't stop until every last vampire is staked and in the ground." Letitia held my gaze for a very long time. Wesley was just sitting there with a glazed look in his eyes, as if he were politely mingling at a cocktail party while his mind was somewhere else. "You always did have terrible taste in women," I said, not expecting him to respond. "That's rich coming from you. Your last date tried to sell me a timeshare." Wesley had snapped out of his trance long enough to crack a smirk, so he wasn't completely out of it. Leaning across the table, I latched onto his gaze until I could feel my mind boring into his. "Get up and leave this place now," I said. "Forget we were ever here." Wesley didn't move. "Oh, Gabriel," Letitia scoffed. "Did you really think a hunter could beat me at my own game? Wesley is my new favorite pet. He won't leave this restaurant until I tell him to, and I happen to be enjoying his company." I scowled, but she wasn't wrong. A hunter's power of suggestion didn't hold a candle to a vampire's. Hunters could make people do things and make them forget what they'd seen, but vamps could go as far as influencing a person's emotional state and even implanting false memories. I grimaced. Your last pets ended up 6 feet under. When a kid kills his first 4 hamsters, you don't get him a 5th. Mortal men are tasty, but not very durable. I can't help it if I get bored. So Letitia was the killer. What do you want? I asked. Clearly she wanted something from me, or she wouldn't have been flaunting my brother. Letitia picked up the menu with long pale fingers, gazing down with a blasé expression. Her nails were painted the color of blood that perfectly matched her lipstick. I'd like to order some food, her eyes flashed, and maybe some sake. I had the sudden impulse to flip the table over and grab Letitia by the throat. But at that moment, our waitress appeared, and I clenched my fists under the table. Letitia asked about the sake, taking her sweet-ass time with her order. She smiled, and Wesley smiled right back, ordering a glass of wine as though he really were on a date. I'd seen this before with vamps and their pets. A vampire's mortal victims would be so enamored by the hypnosis that they'd do anything to appease their master. They'd smile and flirt and be the perfect lover as the vampire sucked them dry. I couldn't tell if she'd fed off Wesley yet. Mortal pets never bore any obvious marks like they did in movies. Any puncture marks would be soaked in the vampire's venom and would heal almost instantly. And for you, sir? Nothing for me, I said, not taking my eyes off Letitia. I won't be staying long. The waitress gave a demure nod and bustled away, and I leaned forward in my seat. What's it going to take for you to get up and walk away right now? We can't leave yet, said Letitia in a tone of mock disappointment. We haven't even ordered our food. I glared across the table at her, and she pulled a prim little smirk. Before I could stake her, the waitress reappeared holding a narrow bamboo tray. She arranged the porcelain flask on the table with the edamame and sake cups. Then she set down Wesley's wine and asked if we needed anything else. No, thank you, said Letitia graciously, reaching out to pour us each a cup. Now, she said as the waitress left, let's discuss this like civilized people. What do you want? Letitia took her cup and sipped. I want my clan to be able to move and feed freely in the city. You know I can't write you a blank check to kill mortals. You can do whatever you want. I dragged in a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. If I don't take care of Denver's vampire problem, the Brotherhood will send another hunter. And I can't promise he'll be as charming and accommodating as I am. Letitia fixed me with a piercing gaze. You let me worry about that. I can take care of myself. I let out a huff of air between my teeth. This was the problem with really old vampires. They had so many rules and ancient customs, but they couldn't comprehend simple law and order. They were ruthless, bloodthirsty barbarians. I glanced at Wesley. I didn't think she'd fed on him yet. Letitia struck me as the type of woman who liked to delay gratification as long as possible. When she finally sank her teeth into flesh, it probably sent her into a frenzy of hunger and lust. She was experienced enough to control her urges, but she only controlled herself long enough to maximize pleasure. All the more reason to get her away from Wesley. Fine, I said, after a moment's deliberation. I won't interfere with you or your clan. Do what you like. Just do it north of I-70, would you? You see, said Letitia, her smile broadening. This is how the Japanese do business. Nothing smooths over differences like some good sake. She set down her cup, looking satisfied. My clan will hunt in the northern part of the city, and you will not touch them. I fought to keep my expression neutral as self-hatred and smugness competed for dominance. I hated negotiating with someone like her. I wanted to exterminate her clan myself, but at least this way she'd run into Cain. Now will you let my brother go? I asked, picking up the cup she'd poured for me in a gesture of goodwill. Letitia narrowed her eyes and smiled. No, I don't think so, she said, reaching over to pluck an edamame pod out of the bowl. She placed it delicately between her teeth, and I caught a glimpse of her long white fangs. Wesley is much too delicious. I fought the urge to upchuck the sake. A fresh wave of molten fury was coursing through my veins. Apparently, I would get the chance to stake a vampire that night. That would make me feel better. But then the waitress appeared at my elbow. "Are we ready to order?" "I don't think we need—" "Nonsense," said Letitia in a controlling voice. "We'll have the oysters, some sabe, humachi, and a sample of your house rolls." "Very good, ma'am. Anything else?" "No, that will be all." "Why him?" I asked, once the waitress was gone. "He doesn't seem like your type." I didn't know the specifics of Wesley's extracurriculars in the bedroom, but I was pretty sure he didn't enjoy being strangled. He was getting too close, the sweet, simple detective. For a mortal, he's not as obtuse as I would have thought, although I suspect he had some help. She eyed me with displeasure. "He does have the most delicious scent," she mused, "and he isn't entirely repulsive to look at." Slowly, Letitia reached over and dragged the tip of her nail down the side of Wesley's face. It dug into his skin briefly, leaving a slight indent on his cheek. Wesley looked over and cracked an awkward grin. I wasn't sure how much of our conversation he was aware of. He could have been screaming inside for all I knew. "You can't seriously be thinking of taking him back to your lair," I said quietly. "He's a cop. You don't want that kind of trouble." Letitia's eyes flashed in a way that made my stomach clench. "I am immortal, darling. I live for trouble. But it's nice to know I won't have any from you so long as my clan keeps to the north." I fell silent, studying her. Letitia didn't take her eyes off me the entire time. She just sipped her sake and leaned into Wesley, occasionally stroking him with the tips of her fingers. Wesley kept glancing at me and smiling uncomfortably, as if his subconscious embarrassment was winning out over Letitia's mind control. If he'd been on a date with a normal woman who was stroking him like that, I'd be giving him so much shit. Instead, I just felt sick to my stomach, and the appearance of our food didn't help. Something about all the raw fish laid out like a buffet in front of a vampire about to devour my brother seemed in poor taste. I couldn't stand sushi because of the smell, and I wondered how a vampire could tolerate it. "Dig in," Letitia said to Wesley, tucking a napkin into his shirt. I rolled my eyes. Wesley sat up, suddenly alert, and took a pair of chopsticks into his hand. He attempted to capture a piece of tuna roll, the least intimidating thing in front of him. I watched as Letitia deftly plucked a piece of sashimi off the platter and placed it in her mouth. I tilted my head to the side, fascinated. Watching a vamp eat human food was a bit like watching community theater. It was all very awkward and overdone, but entertaining nonetheless. Vamps could tolerate human food, but it didn't satiate their hunger. I'd heard that vamps lose their taste for anything other than blood once they've turned, but some kept to the ritual of mealtimes out of habit or made a big show of dining out to placate their mortal pets. "What is this?" I asked, narrowing my gaze. "Why bring me here? You must know that I won't keep my part of the bargain if you don't keep yours, and there's no way I'm letting you walk out of here with my brother." "Actually, darling, that's exactly what you're going to do," said Letitia, calmly placing another bite in her mouth. I rolled my eyes. "And why is that?" "Because there's one vampire for every 5 humans in this room." I glanced around, unable to conceal my alarm as the underlying odor of multiple vamps reached my senses. I'd been so focused on Letitia that I hadn't noticed it at first. Looking around, I could see that our waitress had disappeared. She'd been replaced by a dark-skinned vamp with a halo of tight black curls. A hulking blonde man in a too small chef's outfit was standing behind the counter where the mortal sushi chef had been, slamming a knife down on the cutting board. The vamps were everywhere. I counted at least 8 of them in the restaurant, posing as busboys, servers, and patrons. "If you try to stop me from walking out that door, my comrades will kill every mortal in this place." At those words, my blood began to boil. In truth, I would have gladly sacrificed every person in there to save Wes, but it went against the hunter's code. I couldn't allow all these people to die any more than I could stand by and watch her feed on Wesley and then dispose of him like yesterday's trash. I watched as Letitia produced her wallet and plucked out 4 crisp $50 bills. She placed them on the table and then got to her feet with the off-putting grace that all vampires had. "Come on, my darling," she said to Wesley. "We're leaving." I leapt to my feet. "Like hell you are." At those words, every vampire in the place seemed to stop what they were doing and turn to look in my direction. "Try me," said Letitia, threading a thin arm through Wesley's and patting him on the chest. "Follow me out or try to stop me, and their blood will be on your hands." Wesley flashed an awkward grin, as though he thought she was teasing. I still didn't quite understand how they did that, how they controlled mortals just enough to keep them passive while allowing their natural personalities to come through. A low growl escaped my throat as Letitia steered him out. Only Wesley was such a nice guy that he'd grin at the woman promising to murder him and a restaurant full of people. Heart pounding, I glanced around, taking quick inventory of the vamps. Most of them had returned to whatever human ruse they'd been assigned, but I could sense them watching me out of the corners of their eyes. The one wielding the sushi knife posed the greatest threat. He was armed and had 3 mortals within easy slashing distance. There was no way I was getting out of there without any bloodshed, and the second one of the vamps cut a mortal's throat, they'd lose any semblance of control. "Well, here goes nothing," I said grimly, picking up the nearest chair and smashing it on the floor. Chapter 10. Gabriel. The restaurant fell silent as one of the legs broke off and splintered to form a crude steak. There was the soft metallic clank of someone dropping a spoon, and everyone turned to stare at me. I chucked the sake decanter at Chef Vamp's head. It bounced off his temple and shattered as I leapt across the room. People sitting at the counter screamed as I vaulted the glass barricade and plunged the steak toward his heart. But Chef Vamp was ready, and he was strong. He grabbed me by the arm, holding the steak immobile, and I cursed myself for not having more steaks at the ready. All I had was the silver dagger in my boot and the sidearm strapped under my shirt, both of which were useless against a vamp. I couldn't move the steak any closer to the vamp's heart, so I stepped to the side. Chef Vamp had been pushing all his weight forward, so he toppled headlong into the sneeze guard. Glass rained down over the counter, and I plunged the steak into his back. A woman screamed. A few of the patrons got up and ran, 2 of them heading for the door. One of them moved so fast that it activated another vamp's prey drive. She tackled the man and tore into his throat, but I was fixated on the chef I'd staked. Almost immediately, his heart stopped beating, cutting off the flow of ether supplied by his victim's blood. Within seconds, the ichor solidified in his veins, turning his body hard like marble. I looked up at the encroaching vampires. About half of them were staring at me. The rest were drawn to the bleeding mortal on the floor, moved by their thirst for blood. The vampire who'd attacked him was in a frenzy. She was sprawled across the man's torso, her legs wrapped around him as she drank. Seeing her enjoyment, a brawny, younger-looking vampire edged his way in and tried to knock the first vampire off. She raised her head and growled like a hungry dog, and a third vamp joined in the fight. I rolled my eyes. When vampires were hungry, they were no better than animals, and young vamps were always hungry. A few of the brighter mortals in the bunch had started running for the door, but 2 of the vampires shot across the room, blocking their way out. The mortals weren't getting out of there alive, not if the vamps had any say in the matter. "Shit," I mumbled, upending the chair I'd broken and snapping off the other legs. The low tables around the perimeter only had cushions, but there were plenty of chairs in the middle of the restaurant waiting to become implements of death. I turned just as another vamp lunged toward me and drove a stake through his heart. He made a pathetic gurgling sound, his eyes bulging in surprise. He collapsed on the ground, and I snatched a knife off the sushi counter, throwing it at a skinny vamp who had 2 mortals cornered. The knife lodged in the back of his skull, and he blundered around to see who had thrown it. He was across the room in a flash, and I leapt onto the counter. Picking my way around wine glasses and plates, I jumped down and herded the mortals back toward the kitchens. If they escaped, I'd have to track them down, but that was easier than covering up their deaths. Just then, a vamp jumped on my back and looped an arm around my neck. I tucked my chin and threw my weight forward, tossing the vampire off. I turned and grabbed 2 long knives off the counter, skewering him through the abdomen. A few mortals screamed. The vampire yelled, but all I'd done was piss him off. He got to his feet, blood pouring from his wounds, and I stumbled back against a table. Somehow I managed to lose my steak. The vamp cocked his head to the side, his eyes black with hunger and rage. He was going to enjoy killing me. I'd have to kill him first. I fumbled behind me until I felt 2 chopsticks. They were flimsy, but I'd have to improvise. Grabbing the dagger out of my boot, I rushed the vamp and drove the knife into his breastbone. Blood gushed from the wound as I withdrew the dagger halfway, shoving the chopstick down beside it. The vamp's eyes bulged, and he howled in pain as I worked the chopstick into his heart. I winced as the ichor burned my skin, and I quickly pulled out my dagger. I wiped the vampire's shirt. Ichor, also known as blood of the undead, was highly corrosive stuff. The vamp fell to one knee as his body went rigid. The chopstick had done the trick. Looking over, I saw the 2 vamps who tried to disrupt the female's feeding. 3 of them were fighting amongst themselves. The other 2 vamps were terrorizing the mortals. One had bitten into a screaming blonde woman. He had her pinned against the window. Anyone outside would be able to see. I hoped no one called the police. Bashing a bar stool against the sushi bar, I broke off another few steaks. Even though I'd just murdered 3 of their friends, the vampires were too distracted by the aroma of blood to pay any attention to me. Bending down behind the female who'd been slurping up the mortal on the floor, I jammed a steak between her shoulder blades and watched her collapse on top of him. Her victim looked pale, but he would recover. Mortals could lose a lot of blood. The area around him was total carnage. His blood mixed with the dead vamp's ichor, and I heard a faint sizzle like acid. Just then, one of the 2 who had been fighting leapt onto my back. I grunted as my face hit the floor, and the 2 of us rolled through the puddle of blood. It burned my skin, and I reached for the steak, but it was inches from my grasp. Lifting the vamp by the shoulder blades, I bashed his head onto the floor. The tile shattered, but he wasn't even dazed. He thrust his hips to knock me off him and trapped my legs with his upper body. His fangs were bared. He wanted to feed. His eyes were bulging with hunger. A woman cowering under one of the tables shrieked, an ear-splitting sound that made it hard to think. "Shut up," I growled. "I'm handling it." But the woman continued to scream. Looking over, I saw her purse lying under the table. I grabbed it and looped the long leather strap around the vamp's neck like a leash. Wrapping the strap around on itself, I dragged the vamp toward my fallen steak. Grabbing it, I knelt on the floor and plunged the stake through his heart. I had to throw all my weight behind it, but I heard the satisfying crunch of his breastbone. The mortal woman took a breath. Or maybe she'd passed out from the shock. Looking over, I saw the vampire that had been in a tussle with the others. He was retreating like a wounded animal, but his gaze kept twitching toward the pile of blood. He couldn't resist. Even when he knew the impulse to feed would get him killed, the bastard couldn't fight it. I staggered to my feet, ready to end him, and the woman under the table shrieked. "That's it," I sighed, rolling my eyes. It happened so fast the woman couldn't react. I yanked her out from under the table, drawing my dagger with my free hand. Her scream intensified at the sight of my knife, and I gripped her by the hair. I made a quick slice down the side of her arm. I might have enjoyed it a bit. Her scream faltered as the blade kissed her arm, and she started to hyperventilate. 3 heads snapped in our direction, the only 3 vamps left standing. The closest one to me lunged for the woman. I dropped her and grabbed my steak. The vampire tackled the woman to the ground, but I staked him before he could bite. His body stiffened, and I pulled him off her, thinking he might crush her to death. I dispatched the last 2 vampires and looked around. The mortals were staring at me with terror and confusion. A few of them lay dead. It was lucky the vamps had barricaded the door. It made my job more manageable. I could feel the mortals watching my every move as I crossed to the nearest dead vamp. I tugged off his belt and grabbed the bleeding mortal, looping the belt over her arm. She yelped as I pulled it tight like a tourniquet. Her skin was cold to the touch. "Who does she belong to?" I barked at the mortals. One middle-aged man stepped forward. "Your wife's in shock. Take her to the hospital. She's going to need a few stitches." Before releasing her, I took her by the shoulders and looked deep into her watery eyes. "Forget what happened tonight. You were never here. You cut yourself in the kitchen." The woman nodded and scurried toward her husband, who grabbed her uninjured arm. Shoving the furniture out of the way, I swung the front door open. The other mortals scurried after them like sheep, but I positioned my body between them and the exit. "None of you will remember what happened here tonight. You didn't see anything strange. Don't come back here ever again. You don't like sushi anymore." The dead mortals and vamps needed to be dealt with, but I didn't stick around to do a thorough cleanup. Turning out the lights, I flipped on the close sign and locked the doors behind me. Starting up my motorcycle in the parking lot, I dialed the one person who might be able to help me. She was the only person besides Wes that I had on speed dial. Hunters didn't have many friends. "Morgan, it's Gabe." There was a long beat of silence. "Gabriel Pierce?" I added. I rolled my eyes at her "ah" of recognition. I think she just did it to annoy me. "What's up?" she asked. I could hear her smirk. In a bit of a jam," I said. "I could really use your help." Chapter 11. Gabriel. Wesley's house was dark when I drove past. The shades were drawn, but the colonel didn't bark, which meant that Wesley was at home. I knew Letitia would hear my bike, so I parked 2 streets over. I'd stopped by my apartment to grab my pre-made steaks. They were strapped to my chest with a modified vest that I'd picked up from an army surplus store. They were carved from walnut and sanded to a fine point, perfect for skewering vampires. I had a key to Wesley's place, so I let myself in the back door. I could see light coming from the end of the hallway and knew they were in the bedroom. Moving slowly, I hugged the walls to avoid any weak spots in the squeaky oak floor. I passed the hall bath and heard a scratch of claws, followed by a low, plaintive whine. Wesley must have locked the colonel in the bathroom. I actually felt sorry for the dog. He'd probably tried to warn Wesley that his new girlfriend was bad news. Drawing a stake, I raised it to shoulder height as I crept toward the master bedroom. The door was already opened halfway, and I could see Wesley lying on the bed. Letitia had him spread eagle and shirtless, his wrists bound to the wooden headboard. He had a ball gag stuffed in his mouth, and his face was flushed and sweaty. I let out a slow breath of relief. At least he was still alive. At first, I thought he might be alone, but then I spotted Letitia. She'd stripped down to a tight black corset, lacy panties, and stiletto boots. She held a riding crop in her hand as she paced, and I shoved down a moan of disgust. She was one of those vampires who liked to play with her food. I knew I didn't like her. Before I could reconsider my approach, she muttered something soft to Wesley and brought the riding crop down on his chest. He let out a moan as the leather tassel hit him, leaving an angry red mark in its wake. Stopping just outside the door, I tried to think of a better plan. Surprise would be my only advantage. Letitia probably thought I was dead. Barging into the bedroom would ruin that. So would breaking through the window. It didn't look as though they planned on leaving the bedroom, and Letitia was probably getting hungry. "Care to join us?" she asked in a low, seductive voice. I gritted my teeth. She must have sensed me. "That's pretty sick, even for you," I said, kicking the door wide open. Wesley lifted his head but didn't make any noise. The veins along his neck were bulging, and a flush had spread over his face. I wasn't sure if it was mortification or if he couldn't breathe. Letitia turned to me and squeezed the end of her riding crop, clearly enjoying the new twist to her game. "There's no accounting for taste, Gabriel." "That would require having some taste." Letitia quirked an eyebrow and continued to pace, her breasts jiggling as she walked. Her milky white skin stood out against the black fabric. I had to admit, she was hot. But my dirty thoughts were pretty much derailed by the sadistic look on her face. She seemed tickled by the turn of events, that I'd come to thwart her plans. "I'm curious, darling, what was your plan? Barge in here and demand that I give Wesley back?" I opened my mouth, but Letitia disappeared. By the time my eyes caught up with my brain, she was crouched on the bed, straddling him. She looked at me over her shoulder, pulling back her lips to reveal sharp white fangs. I shook my head, glancing at Wesley. I could hear his heart thundering in panic. Judging by the way her eyelids fluttered closed, Letitia could hear it too. She pounced so fast that I couldn't stop her from sinking her fangs into his neck. I didn't think. I just threw myself across the room and knocked Letitia off him. She rolled across the wide king bed, and her head smacked against the headboard. She continued to roll and landed on her feet, laughing as she wiped his blood from her mouth. In that moment, I realized that fighting Letitia wouldn't be like fighting those freshly turned vamps. Letitia was old and very experienced. She wouldn't be easy to fool. I leapt across the bed to stake her, but she threw out a high-heeled boot. It caught me hard in the center of my chest and sent me catapulting into the dresser. I cracked my head open, and Letitia perked up. I knew she could smell my blood. The only thing more irresistible to a vamp than mortal blood was the blood of a supernatural. We had more ether flowing through our veins. It was like pure heroin to a junkie. Letitia charged at me from across the room, using the bed as a springboard. She landed in a crouch over my lap, her lips mere inches from mine. She drew back her head, ready to strike, just as the window shattered. A blur of brown leather swirled through the opening, and Morgan crash-landed on the floor. Letitia whipped around, genuinely surprised. She'd only expected one hunter. I was the one who'd called Morgan, and even I wasn't prepared. "Whoa," said Morgan, straightening up and gawking at Wes on the bed. But Letitia seemed to recover first. Her hand flew up to her shoulder. I saw a flash of silver and let out a yell, but Letitia was too quick. All I heard was a grunt of pain from Morgan before her shoulders rolled forward. Fury surged through me as Morgan fell to the floor. This couldn't be happening, not to her. But then I saw Morgan raise her head and clamp a fist around the handle. The dagger was lodged just below her collarbone, near the crease of her shoulder. Her face was white with shock and rage, but I didn't stop to help her. For a hunter in battle, it was kill or be killed, and Morgan was tough as nails. Diving across the room at Letitia, I brought my stake down in a deadly arc. I managed to tackle her and pin her for an instant before Letitia rolled me over. She jumped to her feet, but I hooked her ankle and knocked her back to the ground. Her face tightened in an expression of pain, but then she trapped my leg. I winced as Letitia locked in her grip. She was trying to break my femur. I threw my other leg up and over, kicking her under the chin. Letitia sprung back and lunged for the door, but I was right behind her. I snatched her by the back of her corset, tossing her onto the floor. Her head struck the base of the footboard, and for a moment I thought she'd been stunned. I dove in, ready to stake her, but it had only been a ruse. Letitia pulled another dagger, and I dodged it just in time. Still, I felt the blade slice down my arm, and I gritted my teeth in pain. Letitia vanished, and I let out a groan. Where did she keep her knives? Getting to my feet, I stumbled into the hall, leaving a trail of blood behind me. I lunged across the living room at her, taking out both her legs. We went down hard and hit the coffee table, which shattered in a spray of glass. She rolled me over, and I howled in pain as the broken shards dug into my spine. I wasn't sure if vamps took jujitsu, but Letitia was impossible to pin. She landed on top, looking satisfied. She wasn't breathing hard at all. Meanwhile, I was heaving for air. That was one drawback to fighting a vamp. Letitia drew another dagger from her thigh holster. At least now I knew where she kept them. I let out a huff of pain and frustration, but then I heard a low creak and grinned. Holding the dagger to my throat, Letitia shifted so that she was straddling my pelvis and rolled her hips into mine. I might have been turned on if it weren't for the fangs and the murderous gleam in her eyes. I've never had a hunter before. This is going to be fun. More fun for me than for you, I grunted against the cold steel of her blade. Is that right? Letitia murmured, pressing in hard enough to draw blood. Yep. And why is that? A low growl was her answer. Letitia raised her head to look over my shoulder, where the colonel was standing, hackles raised. I knew that growl. It was the only sound I'd ever heard a dog make that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Letitia didn't seem to know what to do. The colonel didn't have that problem. He lunged at the vampire, and Letitia shrieked as his strong jaw clamped down on her shoulder. She arced back and tumbled off me, and the colonel tightened his hold. I was sure her blood was like acid on his gums, but he didn't loosen his grip. I brought my stake down with a grunt of force, slicing clean through her chest. Letitia's shrill cry nearly shattered my eardrums as I watched the ether drain out of her. The colonel drew back, panting and bloodied, and I gave the dog a nod of approval. Morgan staggered into the entryway, clutching her chest in pain. She stopped just outside the living room, and we both watched Letitia's body transform. It was unnerving to watch a vampire ossify. It was sort of like crossing an ice-covered pond. My aim was good, but sometimes I missed the heart. I'd seen vamps reanimate as their bodies hardened. I wouldn't rest until Letitia was 6 feet under. "Thanks for that," I said to Morgan, feeling terrible that she'd been hurt. No problem," she said with a shrug that turned into a grimace. "It's not Friday night if I'm not getting stabbed. This was actually fun." Fun? Only a hunter would call that fun. She'd missed my Van Helsing total body workout earlier at the sushi place. I told her to hang on and rushed out to my motorcycle, where I kept an emergency first aid kit. It wasn't full of bandages and aspirin like a mortal kit. It was designed for supernatural wounds. "Sit down," I said to Morgan as I came back inside. She did what she was told, which meant she must have been in pain. I knelt on the ground in front of her, feeling slightly awkward as I examined her wound. Blood pooled from the gash when she pulled back her hand. It was deep, but not fatal to a hunter. Unzipping the leather pouch, I pulled out some antiseptic spray. Morgan closed her eyes as I cleaned the wound and found the glass vial I kept for patch-ups. It was 100% pure vampire venom, painstakingly harvested from half-staked vamps. Carefully unscrewing the tiny cap, I poured a few drops into her wound. The clear liquid dispersed as it made contact with her flesh, bonding to her blood and supercharging her cells. I watched in amazement as the wound started to heal. It would be completely gone by morning. "Thanks," said Morgan, sitting up straight and gingerly testing her range of motion. "No, thank you," I said. And I meant it. Morgan had no obligation to help me. Hunters worked alone. And yet she'd come the moment I had called and helped save my brother's life. She told me Kane had gone to clean up the restaurant, and I knew she'd cashed in a personal favor. When I finally worked up the courage to go back to the bedroom, Wesley was right where we'd left him. He looked up at me with fear and confusion as I leaned over to remove the gag. He choked a little as I pulled it out, and I noticed several small marks on his stomach. At least she hadn't gotten to the strangling part yet. "Gabe?" he choked, staring up in confusion. "What the hell was that?" I let out the heavy breath I'd been holding, feeling a familiar pinch in my chest. I wasn't sure if he was referring to Letitia or the total stranger who just crashed through his window. "What happened? Where's Letitia?" His eyes darkened as if he'd just remembered me tackling his date to the ground. "What did you do?" His tone was accusatory. That hurt a little. I wasn't sure what to say. Wesley had gone his whole life thinking that I was just like him. He didn't know my world even existed, and there was no reason for him to learn now. "I'm gonna untie you," I said slowly. "But first, I want you to forget everything that happened tonight." Wesley stared back at me, looking dazed, and I forced myself to continue. "You went on a date. It did not go well. Someone broke in while you were gone and caused a whole lot of damage. But you aren't going to file a police report, nor will you be solving that case. You never saw me tonight, or the sexy brunette, and you never want to see Letitia again." I said all of this as convincingly as I could and watched the confusion hit him. It was always more difficult to persuade someone you knew. The closer you were, the harder it was. Some hunters said this was because you saw your loved ones on a regular basis, and eventually something would jog their memory. I thought it was because most hunters didn't want to hide things from the people they loved, and they subconsciously sabotaged themselves. A hunter's power over a person's thoughts didn't take if he felt conflicted. He had to want them to forget. But as I bent over to untie Wesley, I knew he wouldn't remember this. There was no part of me that wanted him to know who I was or what I did.
Thank you for listening to Blood Ties on the Read by the Author show. Let's hear from Tarah.
Hi, everyone. This is Tara. Thank you so much for listening to Blood Ties. I hope you enjoyed the story. You can find the entire series at my website. The series is now complete. Just go to tarahbenner.com/books. That's Tara with an H at the end. And you can actually get the ebook version of Blood Ties for free when you sign up for my newsletter. That's tarahbenner.com/newsletter. But yeah, the series is available in ebook, paperback, and mostly finished in audiobook. And I am also on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can find all those links down in the show notes. Thanks again, and I hope you continue with the story.
Thanks, Tara. Thanks for listening to the Read by the Author podcast. This concludes season 1.5, but I'll be back next week with season 2. For season 2, I'm reading Resonance, the next installment in the Echo trilogy. It's a novella, so it will be a short season, but since it fits chronologically between book 1 in the series, which is Echo and Time, that's the one I read for season 1, and book 2, Time Anomaly, I wanted to read Resonance before we get to Time Anomaly in season 3. I know that's a little confusing. Book 2 is season 3. Anyway, I wanted to remind you that I do record these live with an audience on Discord on Sunday evenings at 8 p.m. Pacific time. The link will be in the show notes, and that's my child meowing. And I hope to see you there. Until then, happy reading and listening.